to... Yes, thank you. Chris Piros will make the introduction for Peter. So go ahead, Chris.
Okay. Welcome everyone to Reform Elections Now presentation of Our Election System is Broken. I am Chris Piros and I'm one of REN's directors. As many of you probably know, Reform Elections Now is a nonpartisan organization focused on addressing systematic dysfunction in the U.S. political process. The group was initially inspired by a 2017 report which argued that current election processes are a primary cause of today's extreme political polarization. And while the problems are very complex and multifaceted, much can be traced to a single source, and that's the stranglehold that the two major parties have on our elections. And that vexing issue is at the core of tonight's presentation. There's a lot to cover, so I'm just going to turn the mic over to Peter Cyrus, REN's Director of Research, to dive right into the formal presentation. Peter, take it away.
Thanks, Chris. So our election system is broken and it's got to be fixed. So let's look at it. There are 6 days until probably one of the most consequential elections in U.S. history. And most of you are focusing on either Trump or Harris. But how are you going to feel 2 weeks from now if 42,000 votes in 3 states determine the presidency, if 18,600 votes in 2 states for Jill Stein and Cornel West swing the Electoral College to Trump, if either Trump or Harris wins the popular vote, but the other one wins the Electoral College, if both sides are claiming victory, if, God forbid, counting is continuing, or more, God forbid, election offices have been burned and workers shot. The reality is simple. You may think Trump is a threat to our democracy or Harris is a flip-flopper, but they're just symptoms of a much bigger problem, and that is our election system is broken. And if we do not fix it, 2024 could be a prelude to far worse elections and a far more divided country. And as you watch the returns, the question you should ask yourself is, shouldn't I be helping to fix this mess? Now, how do we tell our system is broken? Americans don't think government is working. They don't trust elections, media, political parties. While most Americans, more Americans identify as independents, the party keeps increasing their power by manipulating election rules. Almost all elections are uncompetitive, unless you live in a swing state like, Chris lives in Pennsylvania, or in one of the few competitive congressional districts, your vote doesn't count. Our country has become increasingly polarized, and instead of candidates talking about what they're going to do for the people, all they do is attack the other side. Now, let's look at trust. Only 4% of Americans, 4%, say that the system is working very well. 72% say it's not working well or not at all. 80% of Americans are frustrated and angry with their federal government, and that these polls are taken a year ago. Can you imagine what the results are now? Only 16% say they trust the government to do what's right. And in July, Congress had an approval rating of 17.7%. Yet it's got a re-election rate of 95%. Tell me, how does an entity with 68% disapproval get 95% of its members reelected? Now, Americans don't trust their elections. Only 60% thought the 2022 elections accurately reflected the vote. 43% of Republicans and 20% of all voters think there was fraud. 30% of Americans still believe Trump won in 2020. And 48% think that in the next few years, officials will overturn the results of an election because their party did not win. Now, how can democracy work if so many do not trust their elections? And what's going to happen if politicians actually do overturn the results? Now, Americans don't also don't trust their media. In 1976, while we were watching Walter Cronkite and Huntley Brinkley, 76% of Americans trusted their media a great deal or a fair amount. Now that number's plunged to 32%. 39% trust media not at all, and 29% trusted not very much. So 2/3 of Americans have little or no trust in their media. And Americans don't trust their political party. Only 34% of Americans believe the parties are doing an adequate job. 63% want a third-party alternative. In June, 51% of Americans identified as independents, more than the number of Democrats and Republicans combined. So we have a country where voters don't trust government, elections, media, or political parties. Is anybody else worried? Now, our country is highly polarized. In Congress, Senate and House combined, only 45 out of 536 officials have a bipartisan voting record. And this is great. A majority of those who co-sponsored the most bills introduced by members of the other party are gone. They were defeated or do not run for re-election, proving bipartisanship can destroy a political career. But nowhere is the polarization higher than the presidential election. Look at these numbers. 91% of Republicans and 97% of Democrats have favorable ratings on their candidates. But 93% of Republicans and 97% of Democrats have unfavorable rating on the opposing candidate. I don't care what you think of Donald Trump. The fact of the matter is that when 97% of Democrats like Harris and disapprove of Trump, 91, 93 on the other side, why can't we have candidates on which both sides can approve? Now, most of your votes do not count. As you vote, ask yourself a simple question. Does my vote mean anything? In most cases, the answer is no. In the presidential election, if you don't live in a swing state, Northern Maine or Omaha, your votes don't count. Thus, 16% of the population have votes that count. Democrats claim this is the fault of the Electoral College, but other elections are no better. In Senate elections, there are competitive races in states with only 15.6% of the population. In House elections, in 1997, there were 164 competitive races. This year, there are 24, and 8 are in states that use ranked choice voting or top 2 voting, like California and Washington. So if you live in a state with a traditional election system, your vote only counts in 16 of 370 congressional elections, 4.2%. And in state legislative elections, the incumbent win rate in the last election was 96%. 31.9% of all seats were uncontested. So in 39.1% of the elections, voters had no choice, and in only 4% did their choice matter. Now we come to Massachusetts for Senior Austin and Hill. And anybody else who's from Massachusetts that I missed. In Massachusetts, 63% of all state legislative seats were uncontested. So for a few of you, your votes always count. For most of you, your votes never count. Now, why don't elections count? The simplest reason is self-selection. People tend to live with people of like minds. Voters in New York tend to have a different perspective than voters in upstate New York, much less in Mississippi or North Dakota. City, suburbs, and rural areas have different political leanings, but the situation has gotten much worse in the last 50 years as the two parties have taken natural self-selection and found ways to make the elections even less competitive. Now, some voting systems like top two nonpartisan that I mentioned before, ranked choice voting, convergence voting, empower all voters and help elect candidates representing all the people. But our current election system plays into self-selection by maximizing people's pre-existing partisanship. Because the parties control the primaries, they can bar candidates who do not toe the line. By limiting independence, we usually have a left-wing Democrat running against a right-wing Republican. Elections are rarely competitive because incumbents seldom lose. In the past 9 elections, excluding the redistricting years of 2012 and 2022, when a few incumbents had to run against each other, an average of 4 congressional incumbents lost in primaries. And these, remember, these are people with a 68% negative ratings. In the final election, because most districts are highly partisan, the dominant party's candidate usually wins. As I said, there's not even a second candidate in almost 40% of state legislative elections. Thus, 51% of the people who consider themselves to be independents and the moderates in each party are usually left without a choice in either the primary or the general election. Now, here is the amazing thing. While the two parties are losing the support of the voters, with 63% wanting a third party, they have bent the rules to consolidate their own power. They close primaries to non-voters, gerrymandering. They limit registration of people who do not agree with them. They make it difficult to vote. They pass sore loser and anti-fusion laws to keep independents off tickets. They eliminate multi-member election districts. They set election rules that raise more questions than answers, and that, boy, do they control money. So let's look first at closed primaries. By allowing only registered party members to vote, parties keep a strong lock on who gets nominated. 14 states that are listed right there have closed primaries. But here's what's shocking. In using Oregon and Connecticut as examples, 41% of the voters in both of those states are not members of either party, meaning they have no say in the choice of candidates, and they are thus disenfranchised. Closed primaries also enable parties to control their own candidate, because anybody who takes a position at odds with the party can be primaried into retirement. Now, let's look at gerrymandering. In gerrymandering, parties can gerrymander to control the opposing party, moderates from their own party, and candidates who do not understand that parties control the rules. Now let's look at about gerrymandering the other party. And both sides do this. This example mostly fits Republicans, but the Democrats do it too. In 2018, in Wisconsin, a swing state, the Democrats won 53% of the vote, the Republicans 44.7%. That should have given the Democrats a huge majority of the seats. But the Republicans got 63 seats, while the Democrats only got 36. So tell me, how is it possible that a party that wins the popular vote by 8.3 points would lose 2/3 of the seats? The answer is simple. The Republicans gerrymandered Democrats into a small number of districts that most won without opposition. Of their 36 seats, Democrats won 28, with more than 95% of the vote. That's how Republicans could get almost 2/3 of the seat while significantly losing the vote. Now, gerrymandering is gangsta. Parties use gerrymandering to limit candidates challenging incumbents. These are a few examples I loved. I just gotta say that. In 2002, there were two young challengers running against incumbents. The Democrats said, we don't want these guys. So in one case, they moved 7 houses, in the other case, 13 houses, to move these two men to different districts so they couldn't run. So the guy with the 7 houses stated, politics can be pretty rough, but that move was gangsta. Now, this man was named Hakeem Jeffries, and the other gerrymandered candidate was Barack Obama. I mean, can you imagine the Democrats taking affirmative, assertive action to keep Jeffries and Obama from getting into politics? Now, parties also use gerrymandering to limit candidates who don't toe the line. Adam Kinzinger, he was the first Republican to support the impeachment of Donald Trump. He joined the January 6th commission. Republicans threw him out of their caucus. He spoke at the Democratic convention. What did the Democrats do? They gerrymandered him out of his district so he couldn't run for re-election. And now my favorite, Sheldon Silver, who at the time was a Democratic Speaker of the Assembly. He had his party gerrymander the Republican minority whip out of his seat because Silver and the minority whip shared the same mistress. And Silver did not want to share his mistress with a Republican. I mean, when the parties get to a point where the reason for being gerrymandered out of your seat is because you're sleeping with the same woman as some other happily married man, politics has gone too far. Now, the parties make it difficult to register. We have one of the lowest rates of voter registration in the world because the two parties have created rules that make it tough to register. In England, 97% of people are registered. In Canada, 93%. In the United States, 68% are registered. Now, we're talking about elections with razor-thin margins, presidential election with razor-thin margins, where almost 1/3 of Americans can't vote. Now, there's some special tricks in this. And this, I know, sounds, a little hokey, but look at the numbers. The parties, mostly in Republican states, have blocked Americans with former felony convictions from voting. Of these, 5.2 million are Black or Hispanic. As a percentage of the voting age population, we're talking about 9% in Alabama, 8% in Florida, 11% in Mississippi, 9% in Tennessee. I mean, these are a lot of people. So we analyzed the elections, and if felons had been allowed to vote in 2016, Hillary Clinton would have carried Arizona, Florida, Wisconsin, Michigan, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and won a landslide in the Electoral College. And in 2018, Ron DeSantis would have lost the race for governor. Now, if you wonder why felons, in one of the amendments, it says people who have committed insurrection against the United States and other crimes shall not be allowed to vote. It was directed at, at the time of the Civil War, at people who committed insurrection, not people who were smoking marijuana. Now, the parties also make it difficult for the controlling party makes it difficult for members of the other party to vote. Restricting polling places in opposition districts is highly effective. In 2012, Maricopa County, which is where Phoenix is, had 200 polling locations. 4 years later, it had 60. You want to guess what the lines were like when they closed 2/3 of the polling locations? In districts with the highest Latino population, the average wait time was about 3 hours, and in some districts, the vote was 7 hours. In 2020, at Texas Southern University in Houston, the wait was 7 hours. Now, logically, with 7 hour wait lines, many people quit and didn't vote. Now, nothing is, the games they play with Native Americans are really sweet. States have passed laws requiring a street address for voter registration. The only problem is reservations don't use street addresses, they use landmarks. So, Sitting Bull lives 2 houses past the hill or whatever. I mean, but without an actual street address, these people cannot register. They also require them to prove that they were born in the US. Well, their families have been here for 1,000 years, but if they were born on the res, they may not have a birth certificate. And voting requires traveling to a polling place. I love these two. In Alaska, with a district realignment, that's a quote from the government, many living in native villages had to travel by plane to vote. And in Arizona, members of the Kaibad Paiute tribe had to travel 560 miles on round trip on back roads to vote. Give me a break. Can you imagine traveling 560 miles on back roads or jumping on a plane just to vote? Now, this may sound petty. You say, well, why is Peter going on about this? Here's some simple facts. Arizona had, in the last two elections, the margins were 17,000 and 10,000. Just look at the population, 233,000 former felons who can't vote, 332,000 Native Americans who find it difficult to vote, and 1.7 million minorities in Maricopa County, some of whom waited 7 hours to vote. Now, when you look at the results next week, if Trump carries Arizona, the question you should be asking yourself is how, with 233,000 former felons and with the problems for Native Americans and minorities to vote, what would a different kind of election have brought? Now, anti-fusion laws, again, it sounds like, another sort of stupid comment that I'm making. What the hell is anti-fusion laws? It's simple. In the past, candidates ran on more than one party. Ronald Reagan ran as both a Republican and a conservative. Now, this may sound like nitpicking, but its impact on politics has been immense. FDR got less Democratic votes than his opponents got Republican votes in 40 and 44, but he won because he received votes from third parties. In 1960, JFK won the presidency because he won New York with votes from the Liberal Party. And in 1980, Jimmy Carter got more Democratic votes than Ronald Reagan got Republican votes. But Reagan ran on the conservative line, and that was his margin of victory. So what did the parties do? They passed anti-fusion laws so candidates cannot run on multiple lines. So instead of, so we have Jill Stein or Cornel West or somebody like that. And right now, fusion voting is legal in practice only in New York, Connecticut, and both sides are working to make it tougher. And we also have sore loser laws. Now, in the sore loser law, a candidate who loses in a primary can't run in a general election as an independent or nominee of another party. 46 states have some form of sore loser law. In 2010, Mike Castle, who was a Republican governor of Delaware, ran for Joe Biden's seat. He was defeated in the primary by a Tea Party candidate. If he had run as an independent, he would have won the election easily. but the sore loser laws prevented him from doing that. And in 2012, Gary Johnson somebody nominated Gary Johnson to run in the Republican primary in Michigan. Johnson wasn't running as a Republican, he was running as a Libertarian, but he was 3 minutes late to withdraw his name. And so because he, quote, lost the Republican primary, which he wasn't even running in, he couldn't run on the Libertarian ticket. Now, one last thing is multi-member districts. Again, people say, what are multi-member districts? In a multi-member district, multiple officials are elected from the same district. For example, in Arizona, the state legislature has 2 representatives from each of these districts. And interestingly, 5 of these districts elected members from both parties. With multi-member districts, more people can vote for someone of whom they approve, and those elected are often more moderate. So you go in there and you say, I have choices. The 2 parties, however, do not like multi-member districts because they limit their power. So they've worked to eliminate them. Now, most of you young kids don't appreciate this, but in the 1960s, more than half of all state legislatures were elected in multi-member districts. Today, only 4 states still allow this practice. Also, as we said, a large percentage of Americans don't trust the election results. Why can't the parties give voters confidence in results? The answer is easy. It benefits them to keep uncertainty alive. They can claim fraud if they lose, delay counting, and play to their bases. And finally, we come to spending on campaigns. Spending on congressional candidates from 1998 to 2022 surged from 1.6 billion to 8.9 billion. And the party set the rules. So you can donate $3,300 to an individual candidate, or because of a variety of separate committees, 1.8 million to a national party. So they've also rigged the money rules in their favor. So while the number of independents increases sharply, the 2 parties are gaining power by closing primaries, increasing gerrymandering, establishing barriers to registration and voting, eliminating fusion voting, passing sore loser laws, eliminating multi-member districts, making election systems so opaque that nobody trusts it, and passing laws to make financing of independent candidates difficult. Now, how do we fix the system? We need to make Americans feel their vote counts, have competitive elections with candidates from all parts of the political spectrum, make it easy to register and vote, and conduct elections in ways that voters can believe the results. Some of these fixes are easy, some are tough. Some can be done on city and state level, some require federal approval. Some can work quickly, some will take more time, but we've got to start now. So one of the things Democrats bring up is, let's get rid of the Electoral College. And it's clear that the Electoral College gives small states outsized power and switches the election to a small number of people in a few swing states. And the national popular vote would make more Americans believe their votes count. Now, these arguments are logical, but right now, smaller and Republican states will not agree to eliminate the Electoral College. Now, the reason I say right now is here's what's interesting. In 1969, Birch Bayh, who was a senator from Indiana, introduced a bill that the House passed 338 to 70 to eliminate the Electoral College. The thing was flying through the Senate, but then it ran into opposition from Southern senators as well as from urban Black and Jewish leaders. But it almost happened, and it can happen again when the time is right, just not right now. So we're going to focus on actions that we think have a reasonable chance of succeeding. First, states can improve the Electoral College. Now, 2 states, Maine and Nebraska, allocate votes by congressional district. Interestingly, in 2020, both states awarded electoral votes to both candidates. This makes these people in these states feel they have a real stake in the election, also benefited the state. I mean, how often have you seen on TV in the last couple of weeks campaigning in Omaha or campaigning in Maine because there's that little blue dot in Nebraska or red dot in Maine? Now, imagine what would happen if in the election next week, if Maine #2 and Omaha were the margin of victory in electing either Trump or Harris. But why can't other states do it? It requires just simple decision on a state-by-state basis. And if you had another state, with New Hampshire, states with a couple of seats could do what Maine and Nebraska have done, which is allocate 2 votes for the state as a whole, and then votes by single congressional district. That would clearly improve democracy. Now, second thing is, we've talked about changing the election system. We've talked about nonpartisan primaries as used in California and Washington and various forms in Nebraska. And these top 2 have led to more competitive elections, high turnout, and a more bipartisan government. And before I get to the next dot, I just want to say this. The other thing that's interesting, well, I'll say ranked choice voting, and then I'll get to ranked choice voting as used in Maine, Alaska, and other cities, has also led to the same kind of results. One of the things that's interesting is of the people who stood against their party on the impeachment of Donald Trump, these are either Democrats who voted not to impeach Trump or Republicans who voted to impeach Trump. Everyone lost except for people in Maine, Alaska, California, and Washington, which have different voting systems. Now, a third system we've talked about and will continue to do is convergent voting. In convergent voting, which is a round-robin system, you could have a right-wing Republican, a left-wing Democrat, and a moderate independent. And the moderate could win and would represent the views of the majority instead of a minority. So the question is, why shouldn't we have candidates that represent the middle instead of just candidates that represent the extremes? It wouldn't be difficult to make these changes. Now, just so you think this is all a lot of hot air, in this election, Colorado, Arizona, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, and South Dakota are all offering propositions that would create ranked choice voting, nonpartisan primaries, or both. And Washington, D.C. is offering a proposition that would open its primaries. There's real significant action happening, and we just have to keep on it, because changing the voting systems will resolve a lot of our problems. We've talked about opening closed primaries. I think if you live in a state with closed primaries like New York, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Oregon, those are all supposed to be, intelligent states with high educated people, not, the Dakotas, but they have closed primaries. Oh, I guess because the parties stop things. Closed primaries should be open. And having politicians draw their own election districts is like having students select their own grades and SAT scores. It shouldn't happen. We should have nonpartisan independent commissions drawing election districts. 9 states use independent commission for congressional elections. 14 use them for state legislative elections. Everybody should use them. And let's fix the registration system. I mean, our registration system is a complete disaster. First, as I said, we have the lowest voter registration in the world. Many groups like Native Americans or former felons are barred or restricted from voting. But even worse, the state registration systems are hopelessly out of date. If you move from New York to Florida, how does New York know that you're now living in Florida? They don't, because there's no system of sharing information. Now, what that means is if you have a house in New York and a house in Florida, you can vote in both states for the presidential election. Don't worry about it. Now, what we should do about that is we should have voter IDs, allow every citizen to vote, and have a national clearinghouse to share information to keep voter information current. Now, we should also make it easy for people to vote. The idea of waiting in a 7-hour line, flying on a plane, or driving 560 miles on back roads is ridiculous. So the solutions are simple. Provide more mail-in voting without excuses, provide early voting, taking the strain off election day, as many of you have already voted, provide more polling places in cities and in highly rural areas, and make election day a national holiday. I mean, come on, Juneteenth is a holiday. Why not election day? Individual states can extend early and mail-in voting. Congress can make election day a national holiday. And then we should change the laws that empower the parties. I mean, these anti-fusion, score loser, and multi-member districts are just steps by the party to increase their control. And this can be done on a state-by-state basis. Of these three, the one I see as easiest to implement is allowing fusion voting. Look, fusion laws enabled FDR, JFK, and Ronald Reagan to win their election. We're talking about three of the top-rated presidents in U.S. history, Democrats and Republicans. If they worked for FDR, JFK, and Reagan, why can't they still work for the good of the U.S.? And we need to make simple fixes so Americans can trust the results of their elections. As I said before, we need a national registration clearinghouse to allow states to maintain updated voter lists, voter ID cards. How about second-level security? Everybody knows when you go on a website to pay a bill, it says, we're going to send you a 4-digit code to make sure it's you. Why can't voting machines be programmed? So when I go to vote or when they're processing my vote, it says, we just want to make sure it's you. Type in your 4-digit code. And also, early processing of mail-in votes and early votes will provide early results and reduce the uproar of having to wait weeks for results. Pennsylvania doesn't start to process mail-in votes or early votes until election day. And finally, why can't we have independent auditing firms to review every election that will provide additional checks? Corporations have to be audited. Why not elections? And finally, we got to change the money rules. It's just, I don't know about the rest of you, but I am getting really tired of watching all the hate advertisements on TV about this candidate or this candidate. It's just, it's gotten out of hand. So let's just recap. Our political system is at risk. Americans don't like their government, trust their elections. Our country is polarized. Elections don't count for more than 80% of Americans, and much of the problem is self-selection, but the parties make it worse. Our current election system gives control to 2 parties. Now, meanwhile, while the parties should be weakening, they're gaining power by doing all the things that we've talked about. If we want competitive and bipartisan elections, we have to fix the system now. modifying the electoral college on a state-by-state basis, moving to new voting systems like top two ranked choice voting and conversion, opening closed primaries to independents, replacing gerrymandering by independent commissions, fixing the registration system, making it easier for people to vote, making voting more secure and trusted, and controlling and limited the flow of money. Now, we recognize that for most of you, the focus is the election battle between Trump and Harris. But we urge you to wait a few weeks and look at this presentation again, because if there is a screw up in this election, and if 2024 is more fractious or equally fractious as 2020, if it is a disputed election, I think you will come to understand why we believe that our political system is deteriorating, could get worse, and needs to be fixed. So wait until you see the results, and if afterwards you believe, as we do, that the election system is broken, please come join us and help us to change the system. Sorry it went on so long. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That was an excellent presentation. We have a few questions in the chat, but also I think somebody's raised their hand. And if you could stop the screen sharing, Peter, that would be helpful.
I'm going to try to figure it out.
Okay. If you have a question and we call on you, please make sure to unmute. So James, if you'd like to ask your question, and then we'll go to the chat questions.
Peter, thank you. It was a brilliant presentation. As we listened, we thought, whom can we share this with? And we're wondering if Elections Now has reached out to the media to get a broader distribution for this message.
No, no, I'll tell you why I'm laughing. Last night I had a series of communications with the editorial the editorial page director of the Washington Post on this subject. So but we are reaching out to everybody we can reach out to. And if anybody knows anybody, please tell us and we will reach out to them.
Thanks, Peter. We'll suggest you partner with Steve Kornacki.
Okay. Thanks, JC.
Thank you. There's a question from the chat from earlier in the presentation from John German. What is the legal basis for the public purse to fund primaries that don't allow every otherwise eligible voter to vote?
Beats me, John. No, I mean, it was one thing I had included in the presentation and edited out because the presentation was getting too long. But the reality, as you point out, is taxpayers pay for primaries. And if you're not a member of a political party in a state with a closed primary, you can't vote. So it is on my list of things that we think need fixing.
Thank you. We have a question from Jane Susswine. Are there efforts to encourage mail-in voting to address these ridiculous obstacles? I think she was talking about the people that live 560 miles round trip away from the nearest site.
Yeah, there's only one problem, Jane. People on a lot of Native American Indian reservations don't have mailing addresses. I mean, I'm not trying to make a joke about it. What I'm saying is they have, you know, they get a post office box somewhere. They can go to it, but there are some states have actually passed laws. I forget whether it was which one of the Dakotas and a couple of other states that you can't send a mail-in ballot to a post office box. And on most of the reservations, they don't have street delivery.
Thank you. Chuck Hill, you have your hand raised. Can you unmute?
Yes, thank you. I have one request and one comment. The request is the slides or whatever you call them that you put up there were fabulous. Is there any way we can get hard copy of that?
Yes, everybody is going to get a copy of the slides.
Thank you. Second is a comment that I think this is, congratulations. I think this is maybe your best performance ever, both in quality of the substance of it and in the delivery as well. And you really hit a home run this time. Thank you.
Chuck, I really thank you because as you know, as I've said before, you are among the 2 or 3 smartest people I have ever met. I don't mean that facetiously. And so a compliment from you is greatly appreciated. Thank you.
This ruined your credibility, but that's thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Do we have other questions? You can use the hand raise, or you can, if you're on video, actually raise your hand, or you can put a question in the comments as well. And to clarify about the slide deck, it will be posted on our website together with a link to the video, probably by the end of the week.
I'd like to make a comment. I'm looking through some of the comments, and I see an interesting comment from Jason Klein, with which I agree that Jason says, my argument would be stronger if you leave out advocating that convicted felons should vote. And the point I wanted to make sure that everybody understands that is it's only, and I'm not taking a political position on this. In the Democratic states, convicted felons are allowed to vote. In the Republican-leaning states, in most of the Republican-leaning states, they are not allowed to vote. And so my point isn't, that they should vote or they shouldn't vote. My point is that this is a vehicle that the parties use, the controlling party uses to benefit themselves.
Thank you, Peter. There is a question in the comments, another one from John German asking, is there a public list of how to solve each of the many problems pointed out?
No, there's really not a public list, but what our plan is after we see the results of this election, and I'm not hoping that problems happen, but after we see the results of the election, we are going to have specific presentations and calls to action on each of these subjects. So that is our future direction.
Thank you. Do we have other questions or comments? Mary Flannery, please unmute.
Oh, sure. Peter, I'm curious about the idea of having electoral college votes be split. Do you feel like for states like New York and California, that would be very unlikely? And how do we deal with that?
I think, I guess my feeling is the next group of states that would do this would be states the equivalent of Maine and Nebraska, which would be small and, would be, and when you think about it, the idea of, you know, a state like New Mexico or a state like New Hampshire, um, you know, um, being able to give votes to both candidates and how that increases both the participation and the feeling that votes count, and then see how that works. It's for sure that when you talk about what candidates are promising, nobody's promising New York or California anything. They're promising a lot of things to Pennsylvania and North Carolina and the other swing states, and to Omaha and northern Maine.
Thank you. Do we have other questions or comments? We encourage dialogue here. So if you have a point of view, please let it be known.
I think there are a couple of questions that I've seen, some of them not formally in the chat, about how long it will take to make significant changes. I think there is an answer to that, but it's not a short-term proposition what we're doing here.
Well, yeah, the answer is that as I said, some changes can be done quickly. Some changes take a long time. For example, anything related to gerrymandering, the next census is 2030, so it doesn't impact until the 2032 election, except, you got to start working on it now. Other things could be changed for the elections in 2025 or 2026.
Thank you,
And-
Peter. No, sorry.
I just was going to say, in the specific presentations we will have on the subjects, we will talk about the time frame. And as I said, if you look back on the slide that said, here are the states this year, a whole bunch of states are working on things that will change their election system, like in Arizona, Nevada, these other states.
Thank you.
I don't,
Bill?
can you hear me? I'm Earl Sedlick in Seattle and I'm having a hard time on my phone.
Yes, we hear
Uh,
you.
We
Oh,
can see
okay.
you. Yeah.
Yeah, could you, Peter, explain or amplify on there's several states that have said they're going to commit their electoral college to whatever the majority of the United States states say.
Yeah.
So that there would be a popular election and not split by states.
Yeah, ain't gonna happen, because all the look, since the Democrats won the popular vote in 2000 and 2016, but lost the electoral college, many of states that are Democratic have signed on for this compact,
Yes.
but no Republican states have signed on. And the reality is that the electoral college gives a benefit to small states. That's clear. And right now, the Republicans control more states than the Democrats. Now, if small states, and the Republicans did one of the most brilliant things I have ever heard about, which is that I think it was 1888, they were about to admit the Dakota territories as a state. And some senator had the brilliant idea, well, let's split them up into 5 states. So they made North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, and the only state named after a black prostitute, Idaho. And they made them all separate states, which gave them 10 senators. And so the reality is, this is a nice partisan idea for national popular vote, but we're trying to work on things that we think can happen in a bipartisan way.
Thank you, Bill.
And this-
Bill Rosser, you have a question?
Yeah, I just want to follow by saying or asking,
Or we can't hear you.
Well, in the meantime, why doesn't Bill ask his question?
My question?
Yes, you had your hand raised?
I did. The topic is the electoral college and splitting the votes of the electors depending on the popular vote in that state, as opposed to winner take all. I think that's the approach makes a lot of sense to me. Winner take all distorts it to a way, and by having the election allocate the electors based upon the popular vote in that state, it becomes more close to representing the will of the people as a whole.
Okay. There's also a question in the chat from Clark. What do you have in mind for, quote, joining the effort, unquote?
But joining the effort, Clark, is we're just trying to build a team. We're trying to build a team where we can have people focusing on different issues, with people focusing on different states, so that, it's just not, one loudmouth like me spouting off, every other month, but where we can really start to work with local groups on specific issues and create change.
I think one other comment we might make in terms of working with other groups is the fact that since 2017, at least, there've been a significant increase in the numbers of groups that are working on different issues, and the ability to point people to different initiatives to be effective. So there really is a gathering groundswell of people that are working on these different areas, and we're trying to help steer people in the right direction for whatever particular initiative they find is most attractive or productive.
Yeah. Like, for example, we've featured people from Virginia, from Pennsylvania, from Arizona on some of our calls, and we see things happening. In Pennsylvania, last week, the legislature voted to do away with closed primaries. Now, there's still more steps to go. In Arizona, there is a fascinating, an absolutely fascinating proposition on the ballot that basically says the legislature can determine the election system, but here's the rules. We have to have nonpartisan primaries. We have to have a majority winner. And, if you want to make it ranked choice voting or convergence voting or this or that, you can do that. But, hey, this is the kind of election system we need. And it made the ballot. It's got a decent chance of winning. And that's what, we want to find these particular opportunities and jump on them.
Thank you. We have one more question from the chat, plus a lot of interesting comments, but I'll just read the question, and I think we're sort of nearing the end of our time. The question is from David Milam. He says, Milam, sorry. Peter, thanks for all you have given of yourself to these dilemmas. You can't emphasize enough low confidence levels in our legislatures and the incumbent reelection success rates. If this election has a high turnout, how can we capture that energy to reform the process?
And I think, Dave, the answer is if this election has a high turnout and is a mess, you're going to find people interested in what we're doing. If this election is, if we have an election where Harris wins everything, the Democrats are going to smile and we're not going anywhere quick. If we have an election where Trump wins everything, or more importantly, if we have an election that's split and people don't trust, then you're going to find people depressed for the first month and then trying to ask, what can we do? I want to make a comment about a comment I just saw in the chat from Professor Austin, because it is, and I will send you the presentation I gave on this subject, Jim, but this is really what this whole discussion is about. So Jim mentions ERIC, E-R-I-C. It's a nonprofit with a goal to improve election integrity via the accuracy of voter rolls, access to registration, etc. Voters in Massachusetts voted to require the state to join. Absolutely. Now, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that the guy running ERIC, a guy named David Becker, who's a fine guy, I'm not criticizing David Becker, but he used some of, if you believe the Republicans, I'll take both sides. The Republicans did not like the way David Becker used some of ERIC's information. And so every Republican state, almost every Republican state left ERIC. So ERIC, I think there at last count, there were like not one more Democratic state joined, 9 Republican states left. So now in ERIC, all you have is a Democratic clearinghouse and there's no Republican clearinghouse. And the whole point is this: if you are an organization with the goal to improve election integrity, you really have to stay bipartisan or nonpartisan, because a system with only Democratic, because like so many other things in this country, ERIC is an organization that has now become completely Democratic. And that doesn't help, because if you're moving from Massachusetts to Florida or from, some other state to Louisiana, nobody will ever find you. The goal is to make it national so everybody can stay on top of it.
Thank you, Peter. Well, this has been a groundbreaking presentation, and I agree with the previous comment that this is one of Peter's best, and I'm very pleased that we're going to be able to save this and keep it on our website for those who attended and want to refresh their memories, and those who didn't attend will be able to see it at another time. So thank you so much, Peter, Thank you, Chris, for the introduction. And thank you, everyone, for attending tonight. Keep an eye out for future events and encourage your friends to join as well. Good night, everybody.